Here at First Pres, we do our best to give you a little more than you might expect to find at other churches on Sunday morning. That's not because we're trying to proclaim ourselves better than any other congregation. It's just that you've come to expect a little more than the average, and none of us on the staff wants to disappoint you. So as we begin our sermon this morning, let me take you back to September 8th, 2009. Let's go down to Saluda, South Carolina. Saluda is 50 miles west, give or take, of Columbia. It's the county seat of Saluda County and has a population of around 4,000 souls. One of those souls back in September of 2009 was Mr. Lonnie Holloway, who had lived to be 90 years old. Mr. Lonnie had some instructions about his final arrangements that may seem strange to us, but they were his instructions, and they were followed to the letter. Mr. Lonnie left clear instruction that when he died, he was to be buried in the front seat of his 1973 Pontiac Catalina. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I have a certain affinity for 1973 Pontiac Catalinas, since my father owned a metallic green convertible model with a white leather interior, which I got to drive in high school. It was the first and the last time my father was given permission by my mother to buy a car on his own. Bright green, white leather interior, air-conditioned convertible. It was a great car. But back to Mr. Lonnie. Mr. Lonnie wished to have his service at the Rock Hill Baptist Church, and if local news sources are to be believed, Mr. Lonnie's funeral broke all attendance records. Hundreds showed up for his funeral. The pastor was quoted as saying, "This day will be burned in our memories for years and years to come because we just ain't never seen anything like this before." That was not a pastoral understatement. However, as they say on the infomercials, but wait, there's more. Mr. Lonnie wanted to be buried with his favorite possessions in the car with him. So in the front seat of the 73 Catalina were Mr. Lonnie behind the wheel and his guns, which he wanted buried with him so no one could get hold of them and shoot someone. The massive grave for Mr. Lonnie and the Catalina was right next to Mr. Lonnie's wife, who had predeceased him. A wrecker lifted the Catalina and Mr. Lonnie and the guns high into the air and then lowered him into the grave. And then a concrete truck backed up and they poured 3 feet of concrete over the whole shebang. And we must assume that there they are together to this very day. Mr. Lonnie might not have been able to take the Catalina and the guns with him, but he took them as far as he could. A young man of some means approached Jesus and asked him a question. "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, to get the full impact of this interaction, we need to peek ahead in Mark's telling of the story. Mark tells us that after this whole encounter, almost as if offering an explanation, that the young man had many possessions. On closer examination, this tells us quite a bit about this young man. He was in the first place young. He had not lived that number of years required to amass wealth. That in turn tells us that he was a member of one of the 3 classes of the elite: a senator, an equestrian, or a decurion. These were the wealthy in the empire of Caesar, and comprise the top 2 or 3% of the empire's entire population of 55 to 60 million people. This young man had made his money in the old-fashioned way. He inherited it. His entire identity was based on his wealth. He had never known life without enormous resources. While the common laborer of the day might earn 2 or 3 sesterces a day, people in this young man's economic class were earning 500 to 600 sesterces a day. It was what some might call an income gap. And with this young man's wealth went the accoutrement of wealth. He held land. He was involved in trade. He possessed real estate for farming and rental properties for cash flow. His homes were filled with fine furnishings and were well kept by a contingent of slaves. He had closets full of clothes, all the food he could desire, entertainments at his command, and every morning he received a salutatio, a nearly royal greeting, where all the members of his household and his slaves would stand in the courtyard, and he would walk out and they would say, "Good morning." This was who the young man was, and that was the world in which he moved. He comes up to Jesus, kneels before him, and addresses Jesus as good teacher. It is not impossible that there is a little buttering up going on here. He has obviously heard of Jesus, and he is obviously attracted to Jesus' message. Or is he? The young man asks, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" His favorite method of advancement is not hidden. What must I do to inherit eternal life? But eternal life is something that requires a quick look. Eternal life is far more than what happens after we die. Eternal life is about the here and now. Consistent with the worldview of the time, in the time of the Roman Empire, the empire's time was seen to be fleeting because it had failed to recognize the fullness of what God intended for the world, what we have come to call the kingdom or the empire of God. God was expected to intervene in the world's course of things and establish a new age or a new era in which God's empire would usher in a new creation. That new creation, the empire of God, would be marked by God as sovereign and with God's justice as the dominant force. The empire of God would see healed bodies, abundant food for all, peace among nations, equality among people, truth established as a pillar of civilization, and mercy and compassion shared by all people. What must I do to inherit a place in the new age that is to come? That's the question the young man is asking. How can I be a part of the new creation of God? It may well be that the rich young man is genuinely interested in what Jesus is proclaiming. It could also be that the rich young man is hedging his bets. The rich young man may be trying to figure out a way, like Mr. Lonnie Holloway did, of taking his beloved possessions with him into whatever this new creation of God might be. Now, there was something about the young man that Jesus liked. In fact, the gospel tells us Jesus, looking at him, loved him. It is the only time in Mark's entire gospel that Jesus is said to love another person. So Jesus tells this rich young man how he might inherit a place in this new thing that God is about to do. You know the commandments: you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not defraud, honor your father and mother. The rich young man is obviously a child of Israel. For years and years and years he's heard these words, and Jesus is reminding him of the second tablet of the law, the commandments which deal with how we are to live together as a society. He's heard all of it before. He's kept these commandments. But what was that one you slipped in there, Jesus? You shall not defraud? That's not in the Ten Commandments. No, it isn't. But it is in the greater development of the Levitical law. In Leviticus, that well-loved book among some Christians, we read, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when any of you sin and commit a trespass against the Lord, by deceiving a neighbor in a matter of a deposit or a pledge, or by robbery, or if you have defrauded a neighbor, or have found something lost and lied about it, if you swear falsely regarding any of the various things that one may do and sin thereby, when you have sinned and realized your guilt, and would restore what you took by robbery or by fraud, or the deposit that was committed to you, or the lost thing that you found, or anything else about which you have sworn falsely, you shall repay the principal amount and add to it 1/5. For the young man, Jesus is making the move from preaching to meddling. And I'm about to do the same thing. I've kept all the commandments, Jesus, the young man says. I'm a good guy. I'm a nice guy. People like me. They really do. Well, you lack one thing. Sell what you own and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. Hold on, Jesus. I came for a salvation sermon, and you're preaching stewardship? What do you have against me, Jesus? And here's the part of the sermon that makes us all squirm just a little. This rich young man and the power and the influence that he possessed because of his wealth are not part of what God has in mind for the empire which is to come. Using people to benefit our bottom line is not a part of the empire of God. Failing to provide for those who have little or nothing is not part of the empire of God. Jesus is challenging the rich young man and the rest of us to address the very heart of the matter. Jesus is calling the young man and the rest of us to address the systems, structures, practices, and vision of a world in which some have more than they need and in which too many have little or nothing to call their own. Jesus is calling for the transformation of a world in which God provides plenty for all, but a world in which there is a scarcity and a hunger and a poverty and oppression for so very many. How can that be? It is because God's provision is not generously shared or equitably distributed. Jesus is challenging his disciples of old and his disciples of today to find our very identities transformed from being people of money and power and influence who curry favor and seek the company of others who are rich and influential, and become people who serve the most vulnerable and weak, those who have been pushed out to the margins of our society, those who would be allies and advocates for those who have been victims of an unjust society and its practices. And of course, you know the rest. The rich young man walks away, incapable of making the challenges Jesus calls him to make. He will not abandon his power, his possessions, or his influence. He will not turn away from his pattern of using people for his own betterment. He will not turn his back on a way of life that is contrary to the life God creates us to have. He cannot conceive of a life in which he is not at the top of the ladder with all the money and power that he can amass and far more than he will ever need. He walks away. Jesus has simply asked far too much. Is he a possessor, or is he possessed? Are we possessors, or are we possessed? That's the assignment we're given on this first Sunday in Lent. Who are we? And whose are we? Are we the proud and powerful citizens of the empire of Caesar who benefit from the injustice shown to others? Or are we allies and advocates for victims of maltreatment, negligence, and injustice? Are we willing to give what we proudly call ours and care for the countless poor and the impoverished of our neighbors who live in hopelessness, despondency, and discouragement? God has provided plenty and more for our world. God will provide plenty and more in the days to come. Do we believe that? Are we possessors, or are we possessed? This is what we're called to answer in the opening days of Lent. Our answers have significant consequences, so be careful how you answer. And if the stars align, and I should be asked to preach your funeral, please don't ask to be buried in the front seat of a 1973 Pontiac Catalina. That would break my heart. Possessor or possessed, for now and evermore.